Wyoming Territory, 1887. Every Saturday, without fail, Adeline Crowther set out the same table at the edge of the market square. Bread stacked in neat rows, jars of preserves catching the morning light, and a line of pies she'd started baking before sunrise, still warm enough to fog the glass jars set beside them. And every Saturday, without fail, she found herself watching the road from the west for a particular rider. Graham Ellsworth ran a modest cattle operation 6 miles out, close enough that folks in that part of the territory counted him a neighbor rather than a stranger. And he'd been buying the same slice of apple pie from her table for the better part of a year, nearly 50 Saturdays running by her own private count, though Adeline had begun to suspect, somewhere around the 30th, that the pie was no longer the main reason he came. He rode up that morning the same as always, dismounted with the careful ease of a man who'd spent a lifetime on horseback, and tipped his hat to her before he'd even reached the table. "Miss Crowther," he said. "Mr. Ellsworth," she said. "Apple again?" "Wouldn't dream of changing my order this late in our acquaintance," Graham said. It was on that particular Saturday, with a warmth in the air that made the whole market feel a little slower than usual, that Adeline finally said what she'd been considering saying for weeks. 50 Saturdays running, she said, cutting a fresh piece and holding it out to him on a plate instead of wrapping it in paper the way she usually did. "Seems only fair you eat it here for once, instead of carrying it all the way home alone." Graham looked at the plate, and then at her, with an expression that took its time settling into a smile. "Only if the baker comes with it," he said. Adeline laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and set down her apron long enough to sit with him on the bench at the edge of her table. The woman at the next stall, a widow named Mrs. Odell, who sold eggs and butter and considerably more opinions than either, watched the whole exchange over the rim of her coffee cup. "Sun's barely up," Mrs. Odell said to no one in particular, once Graham had ridden off. "Either that man loves pie more than any Christian ought to, or this stopped being about breakfast some months back." "It's pie, Mrs. Odell," Adeline said. Said Mrs. Odell, in the tone of a woman who had counted considerably more than 50 Saturdays herself, and went back to her eggs. The visits, after that, stopped pretending to be about pie at all, though it took several Saturdays, not one, for either of them to admit as much. On a Saturday in late spring, rain came through sideways, hard enough to clear half the market before noon. Most of the stallholders had packed up and gone home by the time Graham rode in anyway, soaked clean through, and dismounted at her table like the weather was a minor inconvenience rather than a reason to stay home. "You rode 6 miles through that for a slice of pie?" Adeline said, handing him a cloth for his hair. "Was told the baker might be here," Graham said, wringing water from his hat brim. "The baker might have had the good sense to close early. Then it's fortunate for me that she didn't." He took the pie she offered and ate it, standing under the small awning she'd rigged over her table, the rain drumming steadily above them, and neither of them made any particular effort to hurry the visit along, though the market square had emptied out around them entirely by the time he finally rode home. On another Saturday, the leg of her table gave way under the weight of a full pie tin, sending 3 loaves rolling into the dust before Graham's hand was under the corner, steadying it, faster than she'd managed to reach it herself. "I've got tools," Adeline said, already pulling a small kit from beneath the cloth she kept folded at the back of the table. "I can see that," Graham said, holding the wood steady while she knelt and tightened the joint herself, watching her work with something that looked, to her, less like surprise and more like approval. "Your father teach you that?" "My father taught me which end of a hammer to hold," Adeline said. "The rest I worked out on my own, same as most things." "Seems you worked it out well enough," Graham said, and did not offer, as some men might have, to finish the job for her, only kept the leg steady until she was satisfied with the tightness of the bolt, which she noticed and appreciated more than she said. On a third Saturday, she made him a pie with half the usual sugar, telling him only that she was testing a new recipe for a customer who preferred things less sweet. He ate the whole slice without complaint and asked, mildly, whether the mercantile had raised its sugar prices again. "Something like that," Adeline said, and didn't tell him for weeks that she'd noticed, back in April, the particular face he made at anything too sweet, a small, private observation she'd kept to herself, the way she kept most things that mattered to her, turning them over quietly before she let anyone else know she'd noticed them at all. It became, without either of them remarking on it, something of a private game between them. Adeline testing small variations on her recipes and watching, out of the corner of her eye, which ones he ate without comment and which ones drew the faintest crease between his brows. Mrs. Odell, watching this unfold across several Saturdays from the safety of her egg basket, eventually took to calling it courting by crust, a phrase Adeline pretended not to hear each time it was said within earshot. It was Graham, on one of those Saturdays, who asked the question that surprised her more than she let show. "You sell out a pie most weeks before noon," he said, nodding at her nearly empty table. "Ever think what you'd do with a proper shop? 4 walls, an oven that isn't hauled out to a market stall every Saturday morning?" Adeline was quiet a moment. "I think about it most days," she admitted. "There's a little building past the mercantile, empty since the harness maker moved on. I've priced it in my head a dozen times and talked myself out of it just as many." "Why talk yourself out of it?" "Because wanting something that large for myself alone feels like tempting fate," Adeline said. "Easier to keep at a table and a Saturday habit than a debt with my name on it." Graham looked at her a long moment. "Seems to me you're charging considerably less for these pies than they're worth," he said. "A woman running a real shop wouldn't need to." It was a small thing, the way he'd noticed her prices instead of only her company, but Adeline found she thought about it longer than the comment strictly deserved. She noticed, over those same weeks, that Graham never lingered past a certain hour, always riding off before the market thinned entirely. Always polite, always somewhere else his mind seemed to need to be. "You never stay long," she said to him once. "Ranch doesn't tend itself," Graham said. 6 miles isn't so far you couldn't spare another quarter hour." He didn't answer that directly, and Adeline, watching him ride west that afternoon, found herself wondering, not for the first time, though more pointedly than before, what kind of house was waiting for him at the end of that road, and why he seemed in such a hurry to get back to something he never once described. They didn't rush toward each other's histories. It came out in pieces, the way honest things tend to when neither person is in any hurry to fill a silence with more than it can hold. "My mother was useful to everyone she knew," Adeline told him one Saturday, apropos of very little. "I'm not sure anyone ever once asked what she wanted." "Did anyone ever tell her the work could wait?" Graham asked. "Not often enough," Adeline said, and didn't say more that day, and Graham didn't press her to. It was several Saturdays later that he told her, in pieces of his own, about his wife. "Her name was Josephine," he said. 4 years gone now. Fever took her quicker than seemed fair, given how much of her there was to lose." He turned his hat over in his hands. "Sometimes wanting another life feels like saying the first one wasn't enough." He rubbed his thumb along the brim. "I know that isn't true. Knowing hasn't made it easier." Adeline didn't offer comfort he hadn't asked for. She only said, "Grief makes rules no one agreed to, Graham. You're allowed to stop obeying them whenever you're ready, and let the rest sit between them, unfinished, the way most true things were at first." There came a Saturday, deeper into summer, when Graham nearly asked her to come see the ranch for herself. Got as far as, "You might like to see the," before something in his own nerve failed him, and he finished the sentence with, "the new foal," instead, as though that had been his meaning all along. Adeline let him have the retreat. "I'd like to see a foal sometime," she said, mild as anything, though both of them understood perfectly well what he'd almost said instead. He rode home that Saturday slower than usual, turning something over in his mind the whole 6 miles, and did not, in the end, ride back out to invite her properly before the following week arrived and swallowed the moment whole. The next Saturday, Adeline set aside the best slice before sunrise, the way she always did. By noon, it sat untouched. She told herself it meant nothing: a late calving, a fence needing mending, any of a dozen ordinary reasons a rancher might be kept home. She sold the slice to someone else near closing and rode home telling herself, without quite believing it, that there'd be a simple explanation come the following Saturday. There wasn't. The second Saturday came and went the same as the first, and by early afternoon, Adeline found she could not keep her hands steady enough to wrap a single loaf of bread. Graham had described the road to his place often enough over the months: west past the dry creek, north at the split cottonwood, 3 miles on toward the low ridge, that she found she didn't need to ask anyone the way. She closed her table early, left the unsold bread with Mrs. Odell, and rode west before she'd fully decided that was what she meant to do. The ride out felt longer than 6 miles. She kept the horse at a pace just short of reckless, past the dry creek bed, north at the split cottonwood standing pale against the afternoon sky, and on toward the low ridge where the Ellsworth fence line finally came into view. She found him in the yard, half collapsed against the fence rail, a badly infected cut along one leg wrapped in a bandage gone dark and stiff, his face flushed with a fever he'd clearly been fighting alone for days. His horse stood a short distance off, unsaddled and grazing, entirely unbothered by the state of its owner. "Fell," Graham managed when she reached him, his voice rougher than she'd ever heard it. "Horse spooked at something in the brush, out past the north pasture. Been meaning to get into town." "You've been meaning to for 2 Saturdays, Adeline said, already working the stiff bandage loose with hands that were, for the first time since she'd known him, not entirely steady. "That's considerably longer than meaning to generally allows a man," Graham Ellsworth. She got her shoulder under his good arm and half walked, half dragged him the short distance to the house, cursing under her breath the whole way at the weight of him and the foolishness of a man who lived so far out with no one to notice if he didn't come back from a fall. Inside, she got him onto the bed, cleaned what she could of the wound with water heated hastily on the stove, and understood within minutes that this was beyond what her own knowledge of cuts and fevers could safely manage alone. She went back out to the yard and shouted across the near pasture until the Ferris boy, working his family's fence line half a mile off, came at a run. She sent him riding hard for the town doctor, with instructions clear enough that even a boy of 12 couldn't mistake them, and went back inside to sit with Graham and wait. The doctor arrived within the hour, breathless from the pace he'd kept, and set to work at once, cleaning the wound properly this time, packing it, and speaking to Adeline directly rather than around her, the way some town doctors were inclined to do with women who weren't kin. "The infection's taken hold, but not past what we can manage," the doctor said, washing his hands in the basin she'd set out. "He'll need the dressing changed twice daily, and someone watching the fever close for the next 2 nights at least. I can't spare the time myself, not with old Mrs. Kettering due any day now." He looked at her plainly. "Can you manage it? Or shall I send for a neighbor woman?" "I can manage it," Adeline said, and did not examine in that moment why the answer had come so quickly and so certainly. The doctor left instructions, a fresh supply of dressing, and a small bottle of laudanum for the worst of the pain, and told her plainly, before he rode off, that Graham oughtn't be left alone until the fever broke properly. Adeline made the decision, without asking anyone's permission for it, to stay. The house, she came to understand over those first hours, had the kind of quiet that belonged to a place built for 2 people and lived in, for 4 years now, by only one. A woman's shawl still hung by the door, faded from disuse rather than wear. Exactly the sort of garment a person keeps not out of need, but because taking it down would mean admitting something the heart isn't ready to admit. A second chair sat pushed against the wall in the kitchen, plainly unused, while Graham ate his meals, on the rare nights he managed a proper one, alone at a table set for one. The pantry held flour, coffee, and little else, arranged with the careful, joyless order of a man keeping house rather than living in one. Adeline didn't move the shawl, and didn't move the chair. She only cooked what the kitchen could supply. Thin broth the first night, when he could keep down little else, and a plain stew the second, once his appetite began to return, and kept the wound clean twice a day, exactly as the doctor had instructed, and sat with him through the worst of the fever on the second night, when he wasn't entirely certain, by his own later account, which decade he believed himself to be living in. He spoke of horses that had died years before, as though they were still waiting in the corral. He asked once, in the depths of the fever, whether the fence along the north pasture had been mended, and grew agitated when Adeline couldn't answer him with any certainty. She held a cool cloth to his forehead and told him simply that the fence would keep until morning, and he seemed, in whatever fevered logic governed him that night, to accept this as sufficient. Back in town, Mrs. Odell minded Adeline's table those 2 Saturdays without being asked, selling what bread and preserves she could, and turning away, with considerable relish, the handful of customers who inquired too closely into where Miss Crowther had gotten to. "She's tending a sick neighbor," Mrs. Odell told anyone who asked, in a tone that closed the subject rather than opened it, though she allowed herself, once or twice, the small, private satisfaction of knowing exactly which neighbor and precisely how long she suspected this particular illness might take to mend. The fever broke before dawn on the 3rd day. Graham woke slowly, his eyes finding the ceiling first, and then, after some effort, the woman sitting in the chair beside his bed, her own eyes red-rimmed from 2 nights without proper sleep. The first word he spoke clearly was not his late wife's name. It was Adeline's. She didn't tell him that morning how long she'd sat listening for exactly that word, uncertain until the moment it came which name she'd been braced to hear instead. By the 3rd evening, with Graham well enough to sit up properly, he reached over without much ceremony and drew the unused chair away from the wall, setting it across from his own at the table. "You've stood through enough suppers," he said. "Sit." Adeline sat. Neither of them mentioned whose chair it had once been, though both of them understood well enough. "I haven't let anyone close since Josephine," Graham admitted later that same evening, once the meal was cleared. "Not because I didn't notice you, Adeline. I noticed you the first Saturday you sold me that pie. I told myself noticing wasn't the same as allowing anything to come of it." "It's not coward's math," Adeline said, when he trailed off without quite finishing the thought. "It's grief. It makes its own rules." "Adeline," Graham said, testing the name out loud for what she realized was the first time.
"Graham,"
she said back. And something in the way they both said it made clear that whatever had been unofficial between them for 50 Saturdays had just quietly become something else. Before we go on, tell us where you're listening from today. And if Adeline and Graham have kept you company this afternoon, leave a like for them. Now let's get back to the ranch, because the fever's passed, but the harder question is still waiting for both of them. Graham's leg mended steadily over the following 2 weeks, and Adeline stayed on past the point the doctor's instructions strictly required. Not out of obligation now, but because she found she wasn't in any hurry to stop. The following Thursday, once he could manage the porch steps without help, she arrived with a peach pie she hadn't been asked to bring. "Your leg no longer requires pie," Graham observed. "Then I suppose you'll have to find another excuse for eating it," Adeline said. But by the following week, with the wound closed and the fever a memory, and Graham steady enough on his feet to manage the ranch alone again, Adeline understood that the reason she'd had for staying had run its course. She packed her few things to return to town, and her table, and her Saturdays, the way things had been before the fever changed the shape of them. Graham walked her out to her horse, and it was there, trying and failing to find the right way to ask her to stay, that he said the thing that landed wrong. "The house needs you," he said. Adeline went very still. "A house may need curtains, Graham," she said, quiet and level. "A man ought to know the difference between a house needing someone and a man wanting her." She swung up onto her horse before he could answer. "I've spent my whole life being needed. I came out here because I wanted to, not because your kitchen was short a pair of hands." She rode back to town that afternoon and did not come out to the ranch the following week, or the week after that. He spent those 2 weeks turning her words over the same way he'd once turned over his fear of Josephine's memory, and came, slowly, to understand what he'd actually said and what she'd actually heard. He rode into town on a Saturday, not toward her market table, but toward the empty building past the Mercantile, the one she'd priced in her head a dozen times and never once let herself claim. He was standing in front of it, measuring the width of the door with a length of twine, when Adeline found him there. "What are you doing?" she said. "Getting the measurements you'll need if you decide the ovens go along the back wall," Graham said. "I asked the harness maker's widow what she'd take for it. It's less than you'd think." He looked at her plainly. "I didn't come to ask you back to my kitchen, Adeline. I came because I want to see you have the one you've been talking yourself out of for a year." Adeline looked at the empty building and then at him. "You're not offering to buy it for me," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," Graham said. "I'm offering to stand here holding the twine while you decide whether you want it enough to ask the bank yourself. That's the whole of my part in it, unless you want more than that." "I don't want you because the house is quieter without you," he added, once she hadn't answered right away. "I want you because every place is." Adeline went to the bank herself the following week, papers in hand, and came out with a loan smaller than she'd feared and terms fairer than she'd expected. The bank clerk, it turned out, had a particular fondness for her cinnamon rolls and was not entirely immune to persuasion delivered alongside a warm one. Graham came into town most days that month to help with the work the building needed, tearing out the old harness racks, reinforcing the back wall where the previous tenant had let the timber go soft, building the long counter himself from lumber he'd hauled in from his own land rather than bought new. "You don't need to do all this," Adeline told him, watching him plane a board smooth on what would become her front counter. "I know I don't need to," Graham said, not looking up from his work. "I'd like to anyway. There's a difference, I'm told, between what a person needs and what they want to give freely. And I mean to get some practice at the second kind." She let him keep at it, and found, over the weeks that followed, that watching a man build something with his own hands for a business that would carry only her name above the door was a different kind of romance than she'd ever expected to want, and considerably more lasting than flowers would have been. He asked her to marry him some weeks later, on the porch of the ranch, the same porch where he'd taken his first unsteady steps after the fever broke, leaning on her arm the whole short distance. "I've spent 4 years telling myself I'd had my share of luck already," he said. "I don't believe that anymore." He took her hand. "Marry me, Adeline. Not because either of us needs tending, because I'd like the years ahead better with you in them, and because I mean to spend the rest of mine making sure you never once have to choose between being wanted and being your own woman." "That's the correct way to ask," Adeline said, and said yes before he'd finished laughing at his own relief. Before the wedding, Graham took Josephine's shawl down from its place by the door and folded it carefully into a small trunk. "You needn't hide every sign that she lived here," Adeline told him, watching. "No," Graham said, "but I think it's time the door held something that belongs to the life we're living now." They married that autumn in the small church at the edge of town. Half the congregation had spent the better part of a year watching Graham buy the same slice of pie every Saturday without once admitting why, and took no small satisfaction in finally understanding it. Mrs. Odell sat in the second row and cried more openly than anyone expected of her, and told anyone who'd listen afterward that she'd known it was serious since the Saturday of the rainstorm, months before either of the two people involved had worked up the courage to say so themselves. The ceremony was plain and short, the way both of them preferred most things. A few words from the minister, Graham's hands steadier than his voice when it came time to make his vows, Adeline's own voice clear and certain when hers came due. There was no elaborate wedding breakfast afterward, only cake she'd baked herself 2 days before and set out on the same long table she'd once used at the market, with half the valley crowded around it exchanging the same knowing looks they'd been exchanging all year. Adeline signed the papers on the empty building the same month, with Graham's name beside hers as guarantor, and nowhere else on the deed. He'd offered, once, to put his own name on the storefront alongside hers, and she'd declined just as plainly. "It's mine," she told him. "You've made that possible. That doesn't make it half yours." "Wouldn't dream of arguing otherwise," Graham said, and meant it. The shop's first winter was leaner than either of them had let themselves expect. Business at a Saturday market table was one thing. Familiar faces, low overhead, no rent hanging over every unsold loaf. A proper shop with 4 walls and a landlord's note coming due each month was a different arithmetic entirely. And there were weeks that first January when Adeline sat at her own counter after closing, tallying figures that refused to come out kindly, no matter how many times she added them. "We'll manage," Graham said more than once, on the evenings he rode in to help her close up. "We will," Adeline agreed, provided the town develops a considerably stronger appetite for bread before spring. It was Mrs. Odell, in the end, who helped turn the tide, mentioning the shop to every farm wife who came through for eggs, until Crowther's Bakery became, by slow and unglamorous degrees, the place a body went not just for Saturday pie, but for the bread that fed a family the rest of the week besides. By the time the snow cleared, the ledger Adeline kept behind the counter had begun, finally, to add up the way she'd hoped it might. She never once, through that lean winter, considered closing the shop and keeping only the market table. Graham never once suggested she should. 4 years on, Crowther's Bakery was busier most Saturday mornings than the old market table had ever been. A line of regulars out the door by 9, shelves of bread gone half empty by mid-morning, the smell of cinnamon and butter crust reaching halfway down the street. Mrs. Odell, retired now from her egg stall, took up a standing appointment at the corner table each Saturday, holding court over coffee and whichever loaf hadn't sold quite fast enough to suit Adeline's exacting standards. Graham still ran the ranch 6 miles west, still worked it mostly alone except during branding season, and still came every Saturday for his slice of apple pie, rain or shine, the way he had every Saturday for years before either of them had admitted what the ritual actually meant. Warmly. He came now, though, with a small girl on his hip, not yet 3, red-haired like her mother, and already possessed of her father's patient stubbornness, reaching for the pie plate before he'd even managed to set her down on the counter. "Same order?" Adeline asked, smiling, wiping flour from her hands. Playful. "Wouldn't dream of changing it this late in our acquaintance," Graham said. Adeline laughed the same real laugh she'd laughed the very first Saturday he'd said it, all those years and Saturdays ago, back when the words had still carried the shy weight of 2 people testing how far a joke could carry an unspoken thing. She cut 2 slices instead of 1 and set them down, one for her husband, one for her daughter, who ate hers with considerably less patience than either parent, and, for herself, the last bite of the first pie she'd baked that morning, eaten standing at her own counter, in the shop she'd built with her own name above the door, in the life she'd chosen rather than merely earned. Outside, Graham's horse waited at the rail, unbothered as ever, exactly the way it always had on every one of the 50 Saturdays that had started all of it, and every Saturday since. Adeline Crowther offered a slice of pie to a widowed rancher on an ordinary Saturday, never expecting it to become the first small habit of an entire life built together. Graham Ellsworth spent 4 years believing loving again would dishonor what he'd already lost. He learned, slowly and imperfectly, that grief's rules are not the only ones worth keeping. And Adeline got the thing her own mother never had the chance to ask for, to be wanted, not merely needed, and to build something entirely her own, alongside a man willing to hold the twine and step back. May God bless each and every one of you who listened today. Until next time, keep writing.